And I must admit, those those ayat were, I would say, taking over my focus in so many different ways that I couldn't really go beyond those ayat. Let's look at them and first review what we did last time and talk about then the ayat that we're doing right now. Let's look at them. So we said بديع السماوات والأرض أنى يكون له ولد ولم تكن له صاحبة وخلق كل شيء وهو بكل شيء عليم. Let's look into it. So we said after Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had laid out the number of different evidences about his uluhiyya, about his existence, laid out whether we're looking at the one that had ripped the seed or the one that created life and death and the one that created and controls all the different things that surround you in skies and morning and dawn and how they function in the sun and the moon, all of these different things, and certainly looking at the stars to find guidance in that and to find that guidance in basically the darknesses in the land and sea. And all of that is to just remind you that it was created for you, that you are one soul, but everything was created in order to bring about stability, and you definitely have the resources, but you just have to recognize that it has to be in the lens of Quran and Sunnah, in the lens of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then tells us, well, He's the one that's in control of all the different things that surround you, whether we're speaking about the resources, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was in control of those resources, whether we're speaking about to see to see an example of that as the water that comes flowing from the skies, coming and bringing about all the different secrets, all the different provisions that are hidden, whether in a small seed coming to later become a big plant, a green plant, or whether we're speaking about multiple seeds coming out to bring about more and more plants, or whether we're speaking about palm trees that from its own pollen, or from when it would be, whether we're speaking about one trunk or whether we're speaking about multiple, or whether we're speaking about different kinds of plants, grapes, olives, pomegranates, all of those. Some would have a similar taste and others would have different tastes and all of that. But that is in order for us to see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in control of every single force, whether that brings a provision or whether that brings a conclusion. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that controls all the different matter and all the different motion and how it eventually would basically appear, or where it is going to be directed into or directed to. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, well, you see those that they would worship other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, some would somehow create their own vision, their own image of what God looks like or who God is, and or probably then make up their own narrative of some kind of an inspiration from God given to, whether we're speaking about jinn or whether we're speaking about making up certain stories of their own, certain legends of their own, of God having some kind of a son, daughter, whatever it is, and not recognize that there's nothing like unto Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Well, what does that mean? Well, that would be something that you could see in how He created the heavens and the earth. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not a creature. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a creator. And therefore, it is impossible and completely contradicting if we were to say a creature becomes a creator. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to understand Allah, خَلَقَ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ. He had created everything. And that's how you would recognize who is God. Well, number one, what defines God is that He is a creator and not a creature. The second definition of God is that he is the cherisher. He's the one that would give you the provision. He's the one that would give you all the different things to keep you going, to keep your life going. At the same time, he's basically the one that you would turn to in your weaknesses to recognize that he's the one to seek help from. So that's why we would turn to him in worship, we would turn to him in support, we would turn to him in seeking different kinds of guidance. Then it jumps to tell us, لا تدركه الأبصار. I want to look at this one because, definitely there's one thing that you would see that the ayat are taking us into. In the first one, wanted you to see the evidence about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in looking at the world around you. But that it took you into a different kind of evidence, the different kind of evidence that other people might say, well, if there is a God, well, why can't I see God? Why can't I just feel God? Why is he so remote? Why is he so remote? Why can't he be close? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then takes us into a different conversation or into a different debate. And that debate is telling us, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually beyond what your eye can see. It's not that he doesn't exist, because your sight is not necessarily the ultimate evidence to prove the existence of something or not, because certainly you recognize that at one point you cannot see with your naked eye a lot of the germs and a lot of different things that surround you. It isn't until later that we had the electronic magnifying glasses or the electronic different things to basically help us see, whether from far away distances that we couldn't see at one point, and then, or things that were very small, and then it was basically we were capable to blow up these things and actually see different details of these really tiny species. And then just because you don't see even farther and there's a certain limit to your vision, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And that's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala letting us know that he is beyond our limited ability of sight, or limited ability of hearing, or limited ability of processing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond all of that. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know, لا تدركه الأبصار. He's beyond what you're capable of comprehending. He's beyond of what you're capable of processing. It doesn't mean that it's not there. It just means you fail to fully process seeing the greatness of the Lord Almighty. It doesn't mean that it's not there. It means that you failed, not that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala failed. Accuse your failure and your limitations of not being capable of acknowledging, recognizing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power. And that's why he said, وَهُوَ يُدْرِكُ الْأَبْصَارِ. And that's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us, well, he could actually go and see, and he is capable of comprehending or knowing beyond your limitations, and his limitations, and he is basically beyond your powers. In fact, your powers were granted by the Lord Almighty, and that's why he's al-Latif, al-Khabir. Al-Latif to meaning that you don't recognize his powers. You don't recognize how subtle he is, but then you might think that that he doesn't exist, or his powers don't exist, because your limited capacity is not recognizing his power that is working in subtle ways. Now, someone might say, well, wait a minute, that still doesn't answer my question. Why can I not see God? Why can't I understand anything that of what you are saying? We'll say, well, wait a minute. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that when we speak about evidence, that the evidence is there, But some may choose to put their arrogance on top of the evidence and may choose to basically deny the evidence because they just want an answer to suit their arrogance. They want an answer to suit their arrogance and not necessarily an evidence to stand up, to be clear to them, and that they can submit to it. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala discusses the epistemology. What is that? The epistemology is basically the knowledge and how we would consider one piece of information as credible as a credible resource in which one is not. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, after laying out the different evidences in the skies and in the stars and all the different things that we would see in the cosmos, that's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, well, قَدْ جَاءَكُمْ بَصَائِرُ مِنْ رَبِّكُمْ. As a matter of fact, you did receive basair. Why did it use the word basair and not necessarily something like ayat and that's it? Because it was telling you before about al-basar. It was telling you before, you're talking about your eyesight, right? And you're talking about what you want to see because you considered that your vision was actually the credible resource to processing whether something is true or not. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, well, you know what? I just told you that your vision is so limited. But I'm telling you, I had sent you basair because I want you to see beyond your limited vision. And I want you to see with your heart, and you had received these basair, these insights, these ayat to help you see beyond your limited eyesight. And that's the different evidences, the different ayat, the different guidance from your Lord Almighty. If you choose to see, well, that's going to be in your benefit. But if you had chosen to be blinded and let your arrogance basically go on top of the evidence because you decided that you wanted to put that as the barrier from seeing the truth, well, then you would have to accuse yourself and not accuse that the evidences had failed to prove themselves. The evidence was actually there, strong, clear, and definitely showing you the magnificence of the Lord Almighty in every corner in the world that surrounds you. But you failing to see it is not the evidence failing to be proven. It's you failing to see the evidence yourself because of what? I want you to look at this one. This one goes, وَمَا أَنَا عَلَيْكُمْ بِحَفِيظٍ. I'm not responsible, therefore. I'm not responsible for you choosing to not want to find those evidences. You basically had chosen to bury all those evidences. I'm not responsible for what decision making you might actually choose to make. I'm not responsible for the consequences. وَمَا أَنَا عَلَيْكُمْ بِحَفِيظٍ. I'm not responsible for any of that. Why? Because as a prophet, وَمَا عَلَى الرَّسُولِ إِلَّا الْبَلَاغُ. As a prophet, the prophet only has one responsibility, which is to deliver the message. But you still fail to say it. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَكَذَلِكَ نُصَرِّفُ الْآيَاتِ وَلِيَقُولُوا دَرَسْتَ وَلِنُبَيِّنَهُ لِقَوْمٍ يَعْلَمُونَ. And they would say, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, you still fail to see it, and you still considered that, the evidences were not enough, and you basically had claimed to bring evidences, but you didn't really bring anything. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, we had actually given you different variant evidences. When you look at the word nusarrif, what does that mean? The word nusarrif comes from the root sa, ra, fa, which actually means to bring direction. So when it says, وَكَذَلِكَ نُصَرِّفُ الْآيَاتِ, in other words, the ayat themselves, the different verses, the different evidences, were actually to give you variant ways of finding the direction to hidayah. In other words, there are different ways to find guidance, but you can choose to take one of these pathways, and you can choose to decline each and every single pathway and decide to make your own pathway. But there's only one pathway to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. At least we're speaking about one path in terms of going to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but there are many directions to Allah. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا. Those that would put the effort in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake, He will guide them to subulana, to His paths. In other words, there's more than one direction, but there's only one destination. It's to Allah. There's only one destination, but there are different paths on how to get to Allah Almighty, but that's not you and I to determine. That's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to determine which path of these takes you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that draws these paths. You decide to take that path. That's why He said, وَكَذَلِكَ نُصَرِّفُ الْآيَاتِ, giving you different signs, giving you different ayat to help you find the way. But then some will say, well, يقولوا درست, and they will claim, well, the past that you're talking about is probably plagiarized from different religions, probably plagiarized from other legends. We're not sure that those paths lead to God. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, well, we're just going to clarify it for the people. We're just going to bring in the evidences, and at the end, if you really want to find the guidance, اتبع ما أوحي إليك من ربك. You want to find the guidance? Well, here's one thing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَالَّذِينَ اهْتَدَوْا زَادَهُمْ هُدًى. You want to find guidance? Well, there's no way to find guidance unless you start in the beginning, on the path of guidance. That's why He said, وَالَّذِينَ اهْتَدَوْا. Those that had started the path of guidance are the ones that are going to increase in finding the path to guidance. And it's the same idea, the same logic. He said, اتبع ما أوحي إليك من ربك. You want to find guidance? Well, here's the beginning of it. اتبع ما أوحي إليك من ربك. You have to follow the revelation that was sent to you from your Lord Almighty. What does that look like? When you look at the word اتبع, the root is tabi'a. The root tabi'a actually means to take one step after another. So someone's leading the way, and then you're looking at their footsteps, and you're trying to find the footsteps that the person that's leading the way, and you're trying to find their footsteps and trying to trace them in order to make sure that you don't lose these footsteps and end up in the wrong path. So that's what ittabi' actually means. Ittabi' means that you take each and every single step seriously. You're looking at the path, you're looking at the steps, you're looking at the destination, and you're also taking that Nabi or that prophet as your role model to mimic their footsteps in order to get to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But what footsteps are those? مَا أُوحِيَ إِلَيْكَ مِنْ رَبِّكَ. What was revealed unto you from your Lord Almighty. Which Lord? La ilaha illahu. He's the one that you would have to worship and turn to and worship. Only one Lord Almighty. But what am I going to find? I mean, what am I going to get to? Well, you're going to get to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But there's going to be a lot of objection. I'm probably going to be accused of being a threat to the society. Oh, absolutely. There's no doubt about that. You're going to be accused of being a threat. You're going to be accused of being backwards. You're going to be accused of all of that. And guess what? You might actually get attacked as well. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَأَعْرَضْ عَنِ الْمُشْرِكِينَ. I want you to turn away, I want you to isolate yourself away from all the different things that al-mushrikeen are trying to bring you into their circle. you would have to determine your orbit. Your orbit is completely different from their orbit. What do you mean by that? The ayat will tell you later on what it means by that orbit. So he'll just tell you, well, I don't want you to get sucked into their orbit. Just want you to recognize if the Lord Almighty had wanted them to not associate partners with him, in other words, take away their free will, he would have actually done that. But he had given them the free will to choose to believe or not to believe. And at the end, وَمَا جَعَلْنَاكَ عَلَيْهِمْ حَفِيظًا. Remember before I told you وَمَا أَنَا عَلَيْكُمْ بِحَفِيظٍ, that with the same concept, tell the mushrikeen, I'm not going to be accountable for your actions. In other words, you've got the free will, you have to use it in the right way. And at the same time, I'm basically telling you, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling the Prophet ﷺ, وَمَا جَعَلْنَاكَ عَلَيْهِمْ حَفِيظًا. You're not going to be accountable for them. In another ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا أَنْتَ وَلَسْتَ عَلَيْهِمْ بِمُسَيْطَرٍ. He said, لَسْتَ, you're not going to be, لَسْتَ عَلَيْهِمْ بِمُسَيْطَرٍ. You're not going to be capable of controlling their choices, their directions, their decisions. That's for them to make the inner will to believe and to choose, to believe and to choose, to apply it. وَمَا أَنْتَ عَلَيْهِمْ بِوَكِيلٍ. And you're not going to be the one that is going to be held accountable, responsible, or even the one to control how things fold in on ground or in their hearts. But still, how do I relate with them? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, listen, وَلَا تَسُبُّوا الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ. Yes, they will attack you, but I want you to be wise in the way you would relate with the disbelievers. Don't let your anger or don't let your own behavior in contradiction with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had told you to let your wisdom and your principle be directed at in order to make it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what does that mean? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, I want you, even when you get this complete enthusiasm for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you get this complete enthusiasm for Tawheed. Great, that's a good thing to have. But I want you to be wise in the way you let your enthusiasm deal, and definitely in the way that it unfolds in relationship with the disbelievers. So what are you saying? He said, I don't want you to use any form of profanity or any form of using provocative words, if of course, when we're speaking about those that would claim other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, basically associating partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or claim other than Allah, or probably be atheist, or claim to have associate partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, etc. I want you to look at the results. Where is this going? If this is going to lead that they would say inappropriate things of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and probably lead to an end and lead to a means of bringing in more harm to you or to the society, that I want you to be intelligent. I want you to be wise in how you let even your enthusiasm for Tawheed to basically be directed in a way that brings benefit even for da'wah. This is important. كذلك زينا لكل أمة عملهم. That's how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So every single society will basically not recognize that certain things are made to appear that they are basically smart choices, and they will see it as it's the right thing, without them realizing that they're actually living a self-manipulation. زينا لكل أمة عملهم. What happens? You need to look at this one. The person's actions is what leads to a certain idea. That's basically what the inference is saying. That your action is going to determine a lot of how you interpret right and wrong, and is going to interpret the different theories that you would later invent to understanding the world. Yes, it's the action. If somebody is engaged in the wrong behavior, then that's going to lead the wrong behavior, that's going to lead that they would have a certain interpretation of probably social theories, or probably money, and probably politics, and etc. The list goes on and on. They would have a certain vision. We had seen that in different figures in history. Michel Foucault, or we would see that his behavior. Michel Foucault was actually a very smart person. This smart person, his parents were actually doctors. His father was a surgeon, very, very smart. But his deviant behavior, disgusting behavior, is basically what led to a lot of those theories that are extremely deviant. No need to go into the details, but they're extremely disgusting. Where LGBT would think, man, you're going really too far. Yeah, trust me, that's how disgusting it is. But then this person is presented as one of the leading figures in history. Why? Because the society itself is corrupt, where it basically starts with that corruption to then later on choosing their figures as, or certain figures as the leading figures, the celebrity, etc. So when you see a corrupt society in behavior, there's no surprise to how the different theories in life and social theories and understanding justice and the corruption will continue to go on and on. And social theories, or probably economical, and probably you go in probably the ideas about God and the ideas about everything in world and life, etc. And it goes one after another. How did we get that far? It was basically the deviant behavior. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لِكُلِّ أُمَّةٍ عَمَلَهُم. Their actions, they become basically the theory that is later going to be nothing but a self-manipulation that it is the right thing. And they'll use all these different manipulations in order to manipulate even the masses. ثُمَّ إِلَىٰ رَبِّهِمْ مَرْجِعُهُم. Then return us to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He will inform them of what they had done. But then the society itself will use a different way of trying to prove that they're right. So what will they do? At least the pagan Arab, they said, hey, we've got our evidence right there. What's your evidence? Well, maybe we couldn't prove that these idols were God, but what we can do, we'll use a different method. We'll أقسموا بالله جهد أيمانهم. We'll swear by God. We'll swear by what? By God. Oh, so you want to swear by God to believe in something against God? How smart is that? How smart is that? That's exactly what they were saying. أقسموا بالله جهد أيمانهم. What is جهد أيمانهم? جهد أيمانهم doesn't mean like, all the power in making an oath. No, that's not what it means. جهد أيمانهم is their belief that in order to make the best of the oath and the highest of the oath is not to swear by Hubal, some idol, or by Manat or Lat or Uzza. No. It's to swear by God, which is considered the higher God. To go what? That those are gods. So you're swearing by the higher God, to confirm your deviation against God. In other words, they don't even see the contradiction in their statements. And this is something extremely important, that in da'wah, if you want to engage in da'wah, want to engage in debate, you would have to learn their own claims. You would have to study their own claims and actually expose their contradiction, expose the discrepancy, expose the different gaps within their theory, within their words, in order to let them see what they could not see. That's what the Quran was wanting to do. Expose their contradiction. لَإِنْ جَاءَتْهُمْ آيَةٌ لَيُؤْمِنُنَّ بِهَا. They were saying, well, if you would only bring in some evidence, we would actually believe in it. And we would have believed in it, but you didn't bring any evidence. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قُلْ إِنَّمَا الْآيَاتُ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ. What did they want? They said, if only you could make a miracle. Like what? Well, I mean, it's similar to those miracles that happened to the nations before. It's not that the miracles are not there. الآيات عند الله. The miracles are actually done by Allah Almighty, not by the Prophet himself. But the miracles were actually right in front of you. You had seen all the evidences of whether we talked about the sun, the moon, the day, the night, the stars, you being existent. All of these different things were actually evidence. فإنها لا تعمى الأبصار ولكن تعمى القلوب التي في الصدور. It's not that your eyes couldn't see the evidence. The evidence is right there, but it's the heart that was actually closed from seeing the miracles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَمَا يَشْعُرُكُمْ أَنَّهَا إِذَا جَاءَتْ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ. They would tell you, if only we had the miracles. And that's to teach you in da'wah that sometimes you might be so hard on yourself wanting to prove a point. We're not telling you not to work on proving a point, but sometimes you just have to recognize that it's not an issue of the lack of evidence, but it's the issue of concentrated arrogance. You have to be smart in how you present your da'wah. And this is extremely important. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَنُقَلِّبُ أَفْئِدَتَهُمْ وَأَبْصَارَهُمْ كَمَا لَمْ يُؤْمِنُوا بِهِ أَوَّلَ مَرَّةٍ. The evidence might actually be there, but then نُقَلِّبُ. If the evidence was perhaps there right in front of them, which it is, and they might want a miracle, something to be extraordinary to what they would think, some materialistic miracle. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, نُقَلِّبُ أَفْئِدَتَهُمْ. Their hearts. I want you to look at the word fu'ad, because the word fu'ad comes from the root fa'ada. I want you to look at this one. Okay, so when you look at the word fu'ad, the root is fa'ada. What does that mean? Fa'ada means to bake, to cook, to warm. When it says نُقَلِّبُ أَفْئِدَتَهُم, it's like, yeah, the heart is being roasted, baked, and it's being flipped and flipped and flipped and flipped. What are you looking at? Why flipped to what? Well, their hearts are inside out. The self-manipulation penetrated farther than the outside of their hearts. It basically went so deep on the inside that it got cooked on the inside, and they didn't recognize that it affected them wholeheartedly. That's what the fu'ad means. Il-fu'ad, wholeheartedly. Deep on the inside. It got cooked. It got so deep on the inside that it's so hard to take it out of their hearts. It didn't just affect their heart, but it affected even their sight. They can't even see the truth. And then what they end up with, نَذَرُهُمْ فِي طُغْيَانِهِمْ يَعْمَهُونَ. And then the consequence, they would continue in a طغيان. What is a طغيان? الطغيان, the root is طغى. The root طغى means to exceed the limit. Remember earlier, we said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically had multiple paths, but there's only one destination to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's only one destination to Allah, and there's only one path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or sorry, there are multiple paths to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but there's only one goal, one way to finding Allah in terms of your destination to Allah basically comes with you would have a vision that is based اتبع ما أوحي إليك من ربك, that is based on الوحي / توحيد, and there's also الاتباع, to follow in a certain action, in a certain determination, in a certain behavior that it matches the vision, الوحي, in what you know about Tawheed, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed to you about Tawheed. Yet, on the other hand, in contrast to a believer, آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات, the disbeliever, their vision is so gone wrong that أفئدتهم and أبصارهم had basically confused everything, whether in their hearts or whether in their sights and all these different visions. But then that, as a result of what? As a result of زينا لكل أمة عملهم. Their actions had made them confuse everything, and that led them to confusing not only the path, but even the way that they would live their life. So they would live in transgressing the limit in each and every single corner. They would transgress the limit in their vision. They would transgress the limit in their social life. They would transgress the limit in their monetary life. They would transgress the limit in their relationship with even their own selves, even with their body, how they treat their body, how they treat their wives, how they treat their children, how they treat the animals, everything around them. They would transgress limit after limit and not even recognize that this is wrong. Why? Because they're living in al-hama. Al-hama or al-hama. What's the difference? Well, you could see this one is ya'mahun, not amun, not that they are not being blinded, because the first one was telling us that they were being blinded. وَمَنْ عَمِيَ. الْعَمَى is different than الْعَمَى. What's the difference? This ama is actually telling us that their eyes were not processing, because there's two things. There's one side is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us that there is al-basar, that there is the sight that could see, but there's also the information in how the eyes within the brain are processing what you're seeing. So what does that look like? You're looking at a tree. The brain is processing a tree. Dimensions, probably 9 feet tall. Green. Looks like some of it is starting to turn yellow. It's looking like it's having some signs of fall. And let's see, some side of the tree is looking like it's probably infected with some kind of a virus or whatever it is. You're processing certain information about the tree. But then to go farther than the limited processing in the tray and the upper part of the tray, to go deeper down, who created the tray? Why is the tree even there? Why does this whole creation even exist? What am I supposed to do? When you're looking at al-ama, it's being blinded from even recognizing that it exists. But when you're looking at al-ama, that's farther, because al-ama is basically when the heart, al-fu'ad, is blinded. When the heart is blinded, that's called ama with a ha. When the eye is blinded, that's called ama with the alif maqsura. You see the difference? So why did it use both? It used both because it wanted to tell us that there are certain things that can be existent, but your relationship and how you process through your behavior, it can affect your senses. Your behavior can affect your senses and can affect your ability to process the world around you, whether to process and understanding the world around you with an idrak, which is basically with an idrak and understanding right there, or whether to process in understanding how things would basically unfold in the implication of, well, what does this mean in practice? How do I understand and process the world around me to recognize what this looks like, in practice in terms of the meaning of how we relate to the world around us. But I still need more miracles. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, well, like we said, even if we were to bring about angels right before them, or to probably even have the dead rise from their death and probably talk to them and tell them about the truth that, yes, we're coming to you from the future of your fate, death. And if even they were to tell them, yes, this is true, you're going to be going to that destination at the end. Whether they had seen the miracles in qubula or qibala in another qira'ah, what's the difference? Qubula basically means as a group. So they were there as a group. And then they all saw the miracles as a group of the angels coming down, or probably the dead coming to life and telling them of their fate, and that this is basically coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and telling them, hey, this is real. You got to take this seriously. Whether that was in a group or qibala in the other qira'ah, to mean that it was face to face, right at their face. ما كانوا ليؤمنوا. They're still not going to believe. They might actually believe temporarily, but ولكن أكثرهم يجهلون. Why did they not believe? Because they lived in al-jahl. Wait a minute. So what is that supposed to mean? That's to emphasize the note that was previously said. What is al-jahl? Al-jahl is not necessarily ignorance in whatever education you got. That's a very simplistic definition for ignorance. Ignorance is in multiple ways of how you could be ignorant in something. Number one, there's ignorance in one, lacking the data. Two, there's the ignorance in having the data, but lacking the processing of how you interpret and how you understand the data. That's another type of ignorance. Number three type of ignorance, you might interpret it right, you might have the data, but then the third type of ignorance is that you don't put that information, that understanding into practice. So you let your ignorance, probably because you understood Tawheed as an example. You understood what a Muslim is supposed to be living like, but did you really put it into practice? Did you really control whether we're speaking about anger or speak about your own impulsive behavior, your emotions or your desires, or did you let your desires control you? So we're talking about one, data, or we're speaking about processing the data, or we're speaking about implementing the data and putting it into action. And that's why the A was telling us, وَلَكِنَّ أَكْثَرَهُمْ يَجْهَلُونَ. So they basically had things gone wrong, either in recognizing the data, or in processing the data, or in implementing the data. We get into all of these data. Where did you get all that from? Simple. All you need to do is just recognize those ayat, and it was telling us in the three different ways. It was telling us, well, okay, here we go. We're talking about seeing the data. That's number one. Two, it was telling you in the other piece of it to understand the data, which is right there. To see the data is number one. There you go. All of this is to see the data. Number two is idrak, فهم data, and understanding the data. And number three is basically putting the data in practice. And if you don't put the data in practice, then you're living in transgressing limits for the data. And then you're going into what? You're going into al-jahl, into a type of ignorance. In other words, it's basically the actions, what you would do in behavior that's going to affect your ability to process ideas, and even affect your ability to let your senses basically process the information. Why did you use senses? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually talks to us about our senses, that they're the main tool to understanding. Wait, the main tool to, wait, I thought the understanding is in the brain. Actually, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you that the tool to understanding is not necessarily in your brain, but part of that tool. In fact, your tools begin not with the brain, but that's where it ends. The tool of processing begins with where your eyes and where your ears would basically lean towards or see. So you're seeing things, then that's basically what will be processed in al-idrak. Your brain is processing what your eyes had first started out in processing, what it's seeing. That's why things like pornography and things like putting your eyes at the wrong things is basically going to affect your tawheed. Absolutely, it will affect your tawheed. And listening to the wrong things, absolutely, without you realizing, it's going to affect your brain and what's processing in your brain. What's processing in your brain, that's the end of it. That's basically, kind of think of it as, well, you decided to put this and that ingredient, and your brain is going to cook based on the ingredient that you had decided to include within your meal. Your brain does not cook. Think of it as brain, fu'ad. They don't cook from ingredients that are not available. The ingredients that are available are the ingredients that you had decided to put in, which is what you decided to expose yourself in seeing, what you decided to expose yourself in hearing, the environment that you decided to put yourself in. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَا لِكُلِّ نَبِيٍّ عَدُوًّا شَيَاطِينَ الْإِنسِ وَالْجِنِّ. Where did that take us into? Well, that's how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, that's how you would say that each and every single prophet had a certain enemy. From what? Well, basically shayateen, they're creatures, whether from the humans or whether from the jinn. What would they do? Well, they would basically give an inspiration. And this inspiration is what? What is it? This inspiration is some words that are beautified to make it seem accurate. It's what? It's basically eloquent words. I want to look at the word زخرف القول. What is زخرف القول? زخرف القول, it tells us that information in itself contained a lot of discrepancies. what they thought was a complete logical idea was actually containing a lot of contradictions, a lot of discrepancies, a lot of faults within it, and a lot of gaps. But they will use a different way in order to manipulate themselves and manipulate the masses and manipulate their followers. What is that? It's using narrative. Nothing as today. Throughout history, it was always, whether we're speaking about the time of the Greeks, or whether we're speaking about the time of Prophet Nuh, or whether we're speaking about the time of the Renaissance and whatever it is, it was always considering search for truth as the center for understanding the world, understanding whether they got to it or not. But at the end, it was always considering the search for truth. But in our time in history, in the atheist time, they would consider that there is no truth. It's all about you making your own truth and then setting a certain type of narrative that is to basically make a new truth, and then therefore manipulating yourself and manipulating others, because of course with the postmodernism, it's, hey, just make your own truth and don't worry about finding truth, because according to the atheists, there's no such thing as truth, that this world is nothing but a bunch of matter in motion, and therefore there's nothing true about what's behind life. So what should we do? We can't live in discrepancy with ourselves. We can't live in confusion. How are we supposed to live our life? Oh, just create a narrative and just create your own definition of truth and create your own definition of lies and all of these different things. Just believe it. You just know it's a lie, but you just have to comfort yourself and just have to somehow live with that lie to make yourself feel better. It's more of a psychological manipulation. At least you somehow just live in some sort of comfort. That's zukhruf al-qawl. That's that narrative that, of course, society is asking us to believe in. And guess what? They're saying it directly. They're literally speaking their lies and with all the audacity, and saying it right there that, yeah, we're going to use a narrative, use your emotions, and speak about it in ways to basically give you comfort. And what is that? It's basically ghurura. What is al-ghurur? Al-ghurur or al-gharur is basically a way that you recognize it's wrong, but you're living in that self-manipulation where it's blown up ego. That's al-ghurur. Al-ghurur is blown up ego. You're gonna blow up your ego. What does that mean? You're going to exaggerate that you are the center. In other words, kind of like individualism. I'm the center, and as long as it basically maximizes my happiness, maximizes and feeding my pleasures, who cares about what the truth is? I'm just going to consider myself as the center, and I'm going to basically consider that the principle would bend to my preferences and not the other way around. Not me bending to the principle, but the principle's bending to me. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, just when they would think, well, see, if God can control us, well, how come he's not controlling us to believing in him? And Allah says, in fact, your Lord Almighty, if he wanted to not give them that free will, he would have been capable of not giving them free will. As a matter of fact, he had controlled everything in their existence, their life and their death. And one day they were not there, and now they're there, and he controls their provisions. He controls a lot of their a lot of the different things in their body, and they can't even control all of that. In fact, just you're waking up in your sleep and you can't even control that piece of it. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَذَرْهُمْ, just let them be and let them live in their claim. And at the end, وَلِتَصْغَى إِلَيْهِ أَفْئِدَةُ الَّذِينَ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْآخِرَةِ وَلِيَرْضَوْهُ وَلِيَقْتَرِفُوا مَا هُمْ مُقْتَرِفُونَ. I want you to look at this one. This one's quite interesting because when you look at the word وَلِتَصْغَى إِلَيْهِ أَفْئِدَةُ الَّذِينَ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْآخِرَةِ, what is الإصغاء? And why is it taking us there? الإصغاء, it's different than السمع. Because when you say, it didn't say وَلِتَسْمَعْ إِلَيْهِ أَفْئِدَةً. It didn't say that. No. It didn't say وَلِتَسْمَعْ. So what does it say? وَلِتَصْغَى. الإصغاء is different than السماع. Because in الإصغاء, you're not giving your full attention to what you're hearing. That's الاستماع. You're walking down the road and you hear a certain sound, music or whatever it is. If you're really paying full attention, that's called istima'. But if you're just walking down, you recognize that there's music being played for this and that singer, but you're not giving it your full attention. You're just, I guess, probably talking on a phone with your friend or whatever it is, and probably not even paying attention. You know very well that there's music being played on in the background. That's a sama'. Al-isgha is different. Al-isgha, you are not fully aware of everything, but you're choosing to put yourself in an area that chooses to speak such discourse. So al-isgha is being lenient towards certain discourse. What does that mean? For example, you're probably listening to or watching certain movies. You're listening to what is being said in those movies, or you're probably a certain type of music. You might say, well, I just like the tune of it. That's isgha. You like the tune of it, and you're probably saying, no, I recognize that there's shit getting, but I'm not going to listen to the shit. And I'll just stop when he says the shit words. I just won't say it. Or, yeah, I'm with these friends, I'm hanging out with them, but, when I'm hanging out with my friends, we just have things in common. We go to school together, and yeah, they might say some things, she's talking about her boyfriend, and the other one's talking about probably the entertainment, that when she went to this and that place, and they're shopping at that mall, and how they found a really good deal and clearance and all of that stuff. That's isgha. You might say, well, I'm not actually talking with them about these things. They're talking to each other, but as they're talking to each other about the clearance and about their lifestyle and about their boyfriends and all of these different things, I'm just there. Yeah, I'm not talking to them about all of that. That's isgha. Why is that important? That's to let us know that the environment that you choose to expose your heart to, al-fu'ad, the environment starts with what you exposed your heart to. That's the beginning of a sentence. Your ear is a certain sense, just like your eye. Previously, it was telling us about your eye's idrak. Now it's telling us about the ear. Before, it was telling us about the eyes and telling us al-idrak al-basar. It was telling us about that, and now it's telling us about, well, how the ear is related to the heart. Ladies, pay attention to this. Sha'ar, there's the poet that had said that the women's hearts, you want to control a woman's heart, you basically control what she hears. In other words, a man, it's quite interesting. You can have this gorgeous woman could fall in love with this ugly guy, the Beauty and the Beast. And you're like, lady, do you recognize your value, and you're way more beautiful than this beast? But then it happens so many times that, this beast or this guy that is extremely ugly, I know that a person's appearance is not what determines the value of a person, but when you sometimes see that how the heart can sometimes be with how and what you hear, and this is something more in women. You can tell beautiful things in a woman's ear and make her feel so endorsed and so precious, and you basically control her heart, and she will fall in love with you because she feels that you had given her the sense of her appreciation. You made her feel good about herself. But the second you made her feel horrible about herself, you had just lost that heart. So I want to look at this one. وَلِتَصْغَى إِلَيْهِ أَفْئِدَةُ الَّذِينَ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْآخِرَةِ. I want to look at this one. What you expose your ear to listening to, even if you're not fully aware of what is being said, that's going to process in your heart. Wait, so before it was telling us what processes in your brain is what you see, but what processes in your heart is what you hear. Yep. You see what those ayat are inferring? What you process in your brain is what you see. That becomes the main ingredient. And what you process in your heart is what you hear. And then without you realizing, all of that creates a certain identity. In the beginning, you're just listening to it, or you're probably overhearing some of that is being said. And then at the end, it basically processes in your heart. And then you reach a level, وَلْيَرْضَوْا. You normalize it. What is الرضا? الرضا is to be content of something. الرضا is to be content. What does it mean to be content? To accept it, to normalize it. That's what it means. So in the beginning, you're probably sitting with these group of friends that are probably talking about whatever. And then without you realizing, you're like, I'm not living their lifestyle. In the beginning, you're just overhearing it. Your brain, or your heart, because you're hearing it, your heart starts accepting it as the new norm. Your heart then would, after accepting it as the new norm, that would eventually lead وَلِيَقْتَرِفُوا مَا هُمْ مُقْتَرِفُونَ. What your heart cooks, remember الفؤاد, what your heart cooks, because the word fu'ad means what something is cooking, remember? What your heart cooks is going to determine later what behavior you implement. وَلْيَقْتَرِفُوا. What is الاقتراف? الاقتراف is to engage in a certain behavior, to engage in a certain act. So when you say وَلْيَقْتَرِفُوا, this is definitely not this isn't an informative clause, but this is actually telling them, well, you know what? Go and do what you do, for you're going to be held accountable. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is holding you accountable to whatever actions, but that's because you had decided to expose yourself to this environment. And that's what processed in your heart, because you basically did not consider that the center that you would determine who is within your orbit is supposed to be لا يأكل طعامك إلا مؤمن. Only eat with a believer. Only be around a believer, because the second you would consider that your center is La ilaha illallah, that's when you're going to see that your orbit, whether what you're listening to, or whether what you're seeing, or whether what you're behaving in, that's going to be determined by the center Tawheed. If the person is not on Tawheed, then أَفَغَيْرَ اللَّهِ أَبْتَغِي حَكْمًا. Should I seek other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as the one to determine the truth? For He had revealed the book mufassala. There are certain details that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed. But the ones that وَالَّذِينَ آتَيْنَاهُمُ الْكِتَابَ يَعْلَمُونَ أَنَّهُ مُنَزَّلٌ مِّن رَبِّكَ. How? بِالْحَقِّ. The ones that would believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, unlike the previous ones, well, they would know that it is revealed from your Lord Almighty with truth. In other words, فَلَا تَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْمُمْتَرِينَ. And don't be amongst those that would be, what is al-mumtareen? Al-mumtareen are the ones to argue with no intention to reach the truth, but with the intention to just basically personalize everything and to be the center. In other words, they're just seeking attention. They're not seeking evidence. They're seeking attention. And the ones to seek attention and not seek evidence, at the end, they will be battling Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَتَمَّتْ كَلِمَةُ رَبِّكَ صِدْقًا وَعَدْلًا. At the end, your Lord Almighty is the one that completes the truth, and it basically is a word that He would decree. صِدْقًا وَعَدْلًا. It contains all the truth in التوحيد, and it contains all the justice in الشريعة. لا مبدل لكلماته. There's no alteration. There's no change in what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed, for He is as-Sami' and al-Alim. He's the all-hearing and all-knowing. And you want to remember, if you think, well, the majority, everyone else is doing the wrong thing, why are you asking me to change? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, وَإِن تُطِعْ أَكْثَرَ مَنْ فِي الْأَرْضِ يُضِلُّكَ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. Just to let you know, if you follow most of the people on earth, they would actually sway you, put you in a deviation away from the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in other words, you cannot choose, or you cannot think that by the majority that's the evidence to prove something right and wrong. The majority does not determine something being right and wrong. Right is gonna be right regardless of how many people see it that way or how many people don't see it. In other words, it's not based on how many people accept it as right. It is the truth, regardless of how many people see it as such or not. And يَتَّبِعُونَ إِلَّا الظَّنَّ. The majority of the people, they would follow speculation. In other words, it's not based on evidence. It's based on speculation. It's based on just their own assumption. And at the end, they would make up these interpretations. What is يَخْرُصُونَ? يَخْرُصُونَ is that they don't necessarily make up a lie just from the start. No, they would make an interpretation. They would make an assumption, and then based on that assumption, they would create a narrative, and those narratives are basically just an accumulated false interpretations, and then it would appear like it's a complete idea with coherent sets of pieces of data. They would think that, yeah, I've got the picture in place. I've got all these things figured out, and I have everything in order. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, actually, they're just yakhrusun. They're creating their own interpretation. They're creating their own lies by making up wrong interpretation after wrong interpretation. Why did you say interpretation? Because one source is what you see, which is what the ayah was talking about. The second source is al-hidayah, is basically the revelation. The third source is what you hear. So those are sources. But then the interpretation is weaving all these different pieces of information into one set of idea. So you've got what your eyes process, what your ears process, that goes into the fu'ad. You've got two areas to help you control and probably cook all these different ideas, whether it's in your brain or whether it's in your heart, in idrak or the heart. And then you've got another source, which is your actions. And that basically becomes the implementation of what your heart, what your brain had processed, and then it becomes a living based on a certain theory, which is basically a number of different sets of self-manipulations. And then إِنَّ رَبَّكَ هُوَ أَعْلَمُ مَن يُضِلُّ عَن سَبِيلِهِ. Your Lord Almighty knows. At the end, you've got one responsibility. Just deliver the message, for your Lord Almighty knows who's deviant away from his path, and he knows who is amongst al-muhtadin. What is al-muhtadi? Al-muhtadi is a person on al-hidayah. What does that mean? Al-muhtadi is the opposite of al-mudil. Okay, what does that mean? Al-muhtadi is a person that follows the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like what? In their vision, the interpretation and the processing of what they had visioned in Tawheed. 2, in processing the information that they heard in Sharia, in Tawheed, and that makes eventually the practice al-hidayah. So al-hidayah involves 1, how you envision, how you hear things, and how you implement it on ground. How you put that on practice, on ground, that's al-hidayah. Al-hidayah is not just in understanding Tawheed. That's one part of it. وَالَّذِينَ اهْتَدَوْا زَادَهُمْ هُدًى وَآتَاهُمْ تَقْوَاهُم. Taqwa is the highest part of al-hidayah. The highest part of al-hidayah is al-taqwa. How? So al-hidayah has different stages. There's al-hidayah that you are on Islam. There's al-hidayah زادهم huda. There's al-hidayah that you're on iman. The highest level of al-hidayah is al-taqwa or al-ihsan. What is al-taqwa? Al-taqwa is when you are living that iman that you take so seriously that you would refuse but to consider the orbits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's al-hidayah. That's al-taqwa. And then فَكُلُوا مِمَّا ذُكِرَ اسْمُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ إِن كُنتُم بِآيَاتِهِ مُؤْمِنُونَ. How does it start? How does my taqwa start? Oh, whether with what you eat, and whether with certain lifestyle, وَذَرُوا ظَاهِرَ الْإِثْمِ وَبَاطِنَهُ. Well, with what all the different details, whether we're speaking about leaving sin, whether the explicit sin or whether the hidden sin, and at the end, you've got certain practices that you would have to avoid in order to maintain al-hidayah. But that's the details of the other ayat that we're going to get to. But this was just a prelude. We still didn't get to all the details. This was just, remember when we do our tafsir, we just get into first the general meaning of the ayat, and then we go in details with those ayat, right? So that's basically what we tried to give in terms of meaning for those ayat. ذَلِكُمُ اللَّهُ رَبُّكُمْ. We just did 2 pages. Let's look at those 2 pages. So we just did this page and this page, but we're still not done because we've got some work to do from Tafseer al-Qurtubi to understand fully what this actually means. So let's see what al-Qurtubi wanted to tell us in Oh dear. Oh, sorry about that. Hold on. Okay, here we go. We got that fixed. Okay, now let's do this, inshallah, and let's start. Okay, let's see. And last time we were doing, let's look at Tafseer al-Qurtubi. Before I would go in details with Tafseer al-Qurtubi, I know last time we did about Masruq, we did It-Talamanki, we did about Junaid, and we went in some beautiful details. I must admit, I absolutely enjoyed it. So let's say right now with al-Qurtubi and what he would want to tell us about these ayat, right? But before that, if there are any questions before I get into the details of Tafsir al-Qurtubi, go ahead. No one wants to say anything. Okay. Okay, let's see. So قد جاءكم بصائر من ربكم فمن أبصر فلنفسه ومن عمي فعليها وما أنا عليكم بحفيظ. القرطبي said قد جاءكم بصائر من ربكم. What are بصائر? So he said البصائر are basically the different verses, the different, when you look at the word ayat, the root is ayaya. Okay, what does that mean? So ayaya, it basically means you're speaking about one data after another data. That's basically that. And then the ayah is the miracle that itself is containing the evidence. Okay, the miracle itself that contains the evidence. And that's why ayat, the verses in the Quran, that they are not, you can't translate them as verses, because the word ayah does not necessarily mean verse, it means miracle. So it's the evidence that contain, well, the information that contains the evidence. Okay, it's the information that contains the evidence. So when it says قد جاءكم بصائر من ربكم, you had received the different. Basair is different than basira. Al-basira is to see something with your heart. Al-basar is to see something with your eyes. Basar, so a person can have basar but no basira. Basar, let's write that down, right? Let's write it down. Okay, let's say. So al-basar, let's write it down. Okay, somebody can have al-basar. Al-basar means sight, but no basira, which is worse. Basira is insight. Okay, let's write that down. Insight. Okay, basar is sight. So a person can have sight but no insight. And somebody can have no sight but have insight. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us what? That you were given basically the different, let's look at the word. Okay, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had told us right there, you've got basically the different evidences that we told you to see through your basar, through your vision. But at the end, of course, if you weren't capable of seeing those evidences with your basar, well then know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent you basair. Referring to what? Referring to the different ayat, the different miracles, the different verses that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent through the Quran. So sent you all those different evidences as to bring you and help you find insight. What is an insight anyways? An insight is to go beyond the surface of what you see. So you're not just seeing a tree right there. That's yeah, you see a tree, it's 9 feet tall or whatever information that you're basically processing by looking at that tree. But the insight is to see beyond the tree and perhaps see the purpose of its existence, and probably see perhaps what it's giving us, CO2 or whatever it is, all these different things. Now you go beyond the surface of what you see. You are seeing farther than just the tree. you have the insight to recognize I need to plant more trees because that's going to basically give us better air, better oxygen. So what are you doing? You've got the insight to you basically see beyond just a tree, and you recognize that there's a deeper wisdom than just the existence of whatever I could see. I recognize a deeper wisdom to whatever I'm seeing, and I recognize the reason and the wisdom behind that existence or what I'm seeing. Okay, let's say, so when you're looking at al-basira, al-hujjatu al-bayyinatu al-zahira, we're speaking about the evidence that is clear evidence and that is apparent evidence. Why was it actually mentioned that way? He said, well, it was mentioned as such to give the inference to basically expose its importance. So just because you may not recognize it, that is the insight, it doesn't mean that it's not there. What does that mean? You seeing the tree, well, good for you. You just saw the tree. But to have the insight and the wisdom to recognize the importance of that tree and what it's actually for is even seeing farther than a surfaced vision. So that is to emphasize that insight is even more important than having the sight of things. And what is the insight? The insight is to see the purpose behind your creation. And that's what matters. What matters is not that you're living. What matters is what is the purpose of your existence. You didn't bring life to yourself, but did you put your life into the purpose that it was created for? That's al-basira. That's al-basira. That's wisdom, is to recognize beyond the surface of things. Because فَمَنْ أَبْصَرَ فَلِنَفْسِهِ, you see things, well, that's going to bring you the benefit. The choices in the vision, the interpretation, the life choices that you make, well, it's going to come back to you. So whatever basically you would find, whether it's an evidence, you recognize it, well, that's going to be benefiting you. For the Lord Almighty, it doesn't benefit from what choices you had made. You benefit from those choices. وَمَنْ عَمِيَ, whoever had chosen to be blind. Who chooses to be blind? No, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that it's not choosing to be blind. It's choosing to not see. What do you mean choose not to see? In other words, choose not to recognize the basira, not to recognize the purpose, not to recognize the wisdoms, not to recognize beyond what you're saying. And at the end, that's you being blind. You had chosen to not see beyond the surfaced vision of what you're seeing. Then that's وَمَنْ عَمِيَ فَعَلَيْهَا وَمَا أَنَا عَلَيْكُمْ بِحَفِيظٍ. At the end, this is to basically give comfort to the Prophet ﷺ, to tell him why. Why was the Prophet ﷺ needing comfort? Because the Prophet ﷺ was like any other human being. He was seeing his loved ones, whether his uncle or whether some of his family members, he was seeing them reject faith. And he knows very well where this is taking them. He knows very well the consequence of this. So it was definitely, just like in multiple surahs where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling him that we know that this was making you extremely sad. We know that this is getting you into some form of anxiety. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling the Prophet said, I want you to know. Let them know, and I want you to know. وَمَا أَنَا عَلَيْكُمْ بِحَفِيظٍ. You're not going to be responsible for what choices they make. وَمَا أَنَا عَلَيْكُمْ بِحَفِيظٍ. I'm not going to be accountable for whatever choices you make. Wow, that's so loud. Can you hear it? You know, I've never heard in Malaysia these loud planes. I know I live nearby an airport. I've only heard these loud planes only in Palestine.
We can't hear it.
You can't hear it? Oh, I'm hearing something really loud. It feels like I'm not in the airport, like right next to the plane as it's basically, going for flying. It's so loud. Man, what are they doing? Is this like a military thing or what's going on? What's going on? Sorry, I don't know why you can't hear it. It's so loud, it's shaking the house. Sorry about that. So okay, وَمَا أَنَا عَلَيْكُمْ بِحَفِيظٍ. I'll try to focus. Okay, you could say, with my ADHD Pro Max, I can easily get distracted with anything. وَمَا أَنَا عَلَيْكُمْ بِحَفِيظٍ, meaning I'm not going to be accountable if you had decided to make the choice to go the other route and decided to basically go to the route of corrupting yourself, or go to the route and decide to take the route of corruption. And let's see, there is another interpretation. It really goes sometimes, you could see sometimes that tafsir, it's just a matter of the way of how they word things and not necessarily a different tafsir per se, or a different exegesis. It's more of a different way of wording things. So just like, for example, in this ayah, لا أحفظكم من عذاب الله. I wouldn't be capable of protecting you from the torments of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you look at that, I mean, it's the same idea. If you were to say, well, I'm not going to be capable of protecting you from the consequences of what choices you basically had decided to make, it's the same thing. Just different ways of wording things. Okay, let's see. There was another interpretation, bihafiz. And what is il-hifz? Okay, where are we at here? وَمَا أَنَا عَلَيْكُمْ بِحَفِيظٍ. This is where we're at. Okay, وَمَا أَنَا عَلَيْكُمْ بِحَفِيظٍ. There is another interpretation. They said hafiz is to actually be not necessarily holding them accountable. In other words, I'm not going to be capable of being accountable for what choices you make, but bihafiz, meaning I'm not the one that is keeping track of what choices you make. In other words, I'm not the one that is keeping track of what actions, what choices, what later happens to you, and the implication of your choices and what happens then. I'm not responsible for that, as I'm only a prophet, and I would deliver the messages of the Lord Almighty, but He is keeping track of everything that you would do and basically the choices that you would make. Here's one thing, is that some scholars actually said this portion of it, they said it was abrogated. Even though it's quite interesting, why would you say that? Because that's an informative clause and not necessarily Sharia. So that cannot be abrogated, because this is an informative clause. Informative clauses cannot be abrogated. The only things that can be abrogated is legislation. That's the only thing that can be abrogated, not informative, because information, truth doesn't change. Okay, that doesn't change. Truth is the truth. Okay, if it's informing you that God is one, informing you that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to hold us accountable on Judgment Day, etc., all of that, that can never change. That never gets abrogated. Why? Because this is informing you of facts. But legislation, yes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can decide a certain rule and then later decide with His wisdom to basically cancel out a rule, or probably put more limitations or more regulations. That's basically something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had done throughout history. كذلك نصرف الآيات وليقولوا درست ولنبينه لقوم يعلمون. This was quite interesting. So what is كذلك? كذلك means that there is a pattern. There's a certain paradigm that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I want you to look at this one. كذلك نصرف الآيات. It's telling us that there's a certain paradigm. Where's that paradigm? Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala let us know that, there are these ayat, there are these verses that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent throughout history just different reminders, just different warnings, and basically different words to bring about a redirection of how people would interpret things and let them see the truth. But this was quite interesting. So you've got the word كذلك. Every time you see كذلك, I want you to think of a pattern. Okay? Because it's trying to tell you that there's a certain pattern in how things unfold. Things just, you cannot live, for example, a life of kufr and expect that one day, somehow hidayah is just going to come to me like that. Not unless you invest towards hidayah, it will not just come to you like that. Okay? And that's the same thing. There are certain things that are inevitable. You put that intention and that investment towards al-akhirah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promised you. You put an investment towards akhirah. You put your intention / sincerity, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promised you, you're going to get Jannah. If that commitment basically is a long life commitment to the day that you would rest in peace, then you're going to Jannah. Okay? But if you had lived your life in kufr and the actions are basically in sin, then don't expect that that's going to somehow miraculously unfold that you go to Jannah. It just doesn't add up. It's what you invest throughout your life that's going to determine a lot of your khawati, a lot of the actions and where this would basically end up. I would say this, just the ones to determine the beginning, or the ones you may start something in the beginning, but then the full judgment is going to be how everything is basically controlled at the end. Like, where are you taking this? Where is this taking you into? How did you eventually make this unfold into? That's why the Prophet ﷺ basically said, "Inna ahadakum la ya'malu bi'amali ahli al-jannah." This is the scariest hadith, that one can do the actions of the people of ahli al-jannah, the people of Jannah. But then they would get so close to Jannah that there would be only an arm reach to Jannah. But then the truth of what had been cooked in their heart and in their brain would just then come to the surface. And then فيما يبدو للناس, to what appears to people, hey, this guy is looking like he's going to get it to Jannah. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, well, the Prophet says, and then it unfolds the reality of what they were processing in their heart and their brain, and then that eventually goes into or onto the surface and then takes them to hellfire. Nas'Allah al-afwa wal-afiyah. That's so scary. Okay, there are two qira'at for this one. وَلْيَقُولُوا and وَلْيَقُولُوا. Two qira'at. وَلْيَقُولُوا and وَلْيَقُولُوا. What's the difference? So if you are saying وَلْيَقُولُوا, this is basically, or وَلْيَقُولُوا, let's start with that one, because here's talking about lam as-sayrura. This is talking to us about the process of what actually happens. So in other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling the Prophet ﷺ, anticipate that they will claim, because they cannot fully comprehend and they don't want to comprehend the information that you had come with, anticipate that they will claim that you had somehow learned this, plagiarized this from other resources. So this would be وَلْيَقُولُ. وَلْيَقُولُ is different because وَلْيَقُولُ is basically saying, well, even if they were to say that, even if they were to say, and certainly they had claimed that they had claimed that this was all plagiarized from other resources. And by the way, I actually prepared one thing. Let me put that out for you. Okay, let's see. And where was it? I'm going to put that out for you. Okay, and I hope I can, let's see what I can do. Okay, want you to see this one. Let's see if I can. Okay, I'm going to put one piece at a time. Let me see if I have my notes in place. Okay, so what is the story here? The story is, of course, they had claimed that the Prophet ﷺ had plagiarized the Quran from previous scriptures because they had seen certain similarities or at least certain words right there. And I'll just say there is a very important book, unfortunately, the book has not yet been translated. Let me show you what that book is. Sorry for, that one. I'm going to write it there. Shubhat, and it's called Iqtibas Quran. Okay. This book had not been translated yet. Okay. But inshallah, it will get translated. Okay. What is that book about? So this book, here we go. This is it. Actually, there's a different one. Hold on. Where is it? Let me see if I can. Okay. I'm going to show you that book. Okay. I'm going to get to that. That's basically the author. Okay. The book is in approximately 500 pages. Okay. But the book goes in details. Here we go. No, not this one. Okay. Goes in details. Was the Quran plagiarized from the book, the Christian books and the Jewish scriptures? So it goes in lots of details in that regard. Let's see. هل اقتبس القرآن من كتب اليهود والنصارى? Let's see. I'm trying to. Let's see. I have the book at home. Okay. Okay. So this is basically the author. And here we go. This is the book. This is the book. Okay. So what does this actually talk about? It's actually, did I say 400 pages? So it's almost in 800 pages, 600 pages, 800 pages, somewhere around there. What does the book talk about? The book talks about, did the Quran or was the Quran plagiarized from the Jewish and Christian scriptures, or not only the scriptures? We're talking about not only the Old Testament and the New Testament, or the Torah and the New Testament. What we're talking about, the Mishnah, we're talking about just the variant Christian and Jewish resources. So, of course, this book goes in details in just for the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. This just the story of Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam actually shows 60 differences comparing the Quran's version and basically the Old Testament's version about the story of Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam. 60 different 16 different variants. And certainly the book goes in a lot of details. So I decided that, I'm just going to, since I'm not going to go in details about the book, I thought it would be a good idea to at least mention some things about what the book is really about. Okay, so I wanted to list right there. Let's see. What is the book really about? So number one, it basically talks about the whole idea. Did the Quran plagiarize and get that information from the Jewish and Christian scriptures? So it goes and says, well, let us put a couple certain assumptions here, or a number of different hypotheses right here. Number one is saying, well, there are certain stories that are similar in certain chronology or in certain details as the ones that are in the Old Testament or the Torah or even the New Testament or the Gospels. And number two is that there was this hypothesis that they said, well, the Prophet ﷺ was living amongst the Jews and the Christians anyway, so probably had taken some information from them, whether we're speaking about legends or whether information. And the third hypothesis said, well, we could see some information in regards to legislation, so like fasting, or probably certain halal, haram, or, kosher, or whatever it is, that here there are certain similarities in that. And of course, certainly, in order to get to that, then they said, well, perhaps there was someone else that was teaching him or giving him some of that inspiration, and therefore we could use that as an evidence. I am actually recording. So they would claim that well, he wasn't a prophet, and therefore we could just say that he was taught, and the information that he was coming with, it was coming from another human being basically teaching him. So, and of course, the reason why they're putting in all these different hypotheses are basically to say that Quran is not a revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that the Prophet ﷺ was somehow just plagiarizing the Quran from the previous scriptures, or probably he just wanted to mimic those previous scriptures. And that's why basically in that book that I showed you earlier, basically wanted to go to each and every single one of these claims, each and every single one of these hypotheses, and actually talk about the Prophet ﷺ, whether he was illiterate, to basically prove that there are these variants and that the Quran was not at all, in fact, intending to somehow confirm or even just bring about similar pieces of information, but many times it would say, well, as a matter of fact, here's, in contradiction to what that scripture says, here's what the truth really is. Here's the truth about this piece of information, that piece of information. So it didn't come to affirm, but many times it came into basically reject a number of different things. So that's when, of course, you would say the details, the evidence to prove that the Prophet ﷺ did not have any information about the previous scriptures. So that's when the Quran would say, وَمَا كُنْتَ تَتْلُو مِنْ قَبْلِهِ مِنْ كِتَابٍ. You did not recite any book, they did not have any information about previous scriptures. And then the author, basically Sami Amri here, would go in details about what we know in terms of the available translated manuscripts. Did he basically have any information about, let's say, available sciences, available translations to these scriptures? When were they translated? What do we know about the available resources that were available to the Prophet ﷺ at the time? Were there even Jews and Christians? And how many people were living around the Prophet ﷺ from the Jews and Christians? So were they available at the time when the Prophet ﷺ was speaking of al-Wahy? We only know of 4, we only know Abdullah ibn Jahsh, we only know of Waraq ibn Nawfal. Those were the only 2 Christians within basically Mecca. So we would go in the different evidences to prove that. And certainly another piece of that is basically the Prophet ﷺ being illiterate. And that wasn't something that was necessarily to degrade the Prophet ﷺ, but that was to prove that he did not have access to the other scriptures to somehow prove that, yeah, you had access to that information, you read that information, and now you're bringing it up. Well, the Quran is always insisting that he was actually illiterate. In fact, the whole society was illiterate. So it was a very primitive society that didn't have access to any of that information. And therefore, the Quran would come in to say, well, what the Quran was really coming in was as an independent revelation and not something that as mimicking or trying to plagiarize the previous revelation. In fact, it was a completely independent revelation. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was saying, وَأَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الْكِتَابَ بِالْحَقِّ مُصَدِّقًا لِمَا بَيْنَ يَدَيْهِ. In fact, it was affirming certain pieces of information, but then مُهَيْمِنًا عَلَيْهِ. In fact, it surpasses, it has a lot to add onto that information. The other part is that basically comes in to bring about the witnesses, basically, of whether we're speaking about some of the scholars of theologians or rabbis, or even the previous scholars, and how they would attest and testify basically to the different variant evidences, and certainly to speak about whether Orientalist, or certainly to attest how the Prophet ﷺ was appealing to some of those scholars that lived even at the time, and that in itself was a testimony from them that he did not have access to any of that information, or did not whatsoever have any pieces of it, let alone details. And therefore, that the Quran itself is basically containing the i'jaz, containing the miracle itself. And that's why the Quran was challenging them and telling them, قُلْ فَأْتُوا بِسُورَةٍ مِّن مِثْلِهِ, challenging the Arab. Well, you know what? If you say that we had access, go get access to that piece of information. Go ahead, the whole society. Go get access to that piece of information that you claim I had. Go get it. It's probably going to be available to you too, or else why would I somehow have the ability to get access to it and not you? Go get access to that information and make a similar Quran, make similar words. And you know what? You as a whole society, all the society put together, get into that challenge and say, make one surah, make one ayah, make 10 ayat. Let's see what you could do. But of course, fail to do that. So the Quran would basically come in to say, well, the Prophet ﷺ was basically getting the revelation from the Lord Almighty himself, and that the Quran itself contains the miracle itself. Of course, this is a very shallow summary for that book. Like I said, the book is almost 800 pages, so it would be definitely extremely hard for me to just summarize an 800-page book with just a couple bullet points, but at least, get a taste of what it's actually talking about, and hopefully, inshallah, get us into maybe one day, maybe getting this book translated, right? So this is it. So when you look at وَلْيَقُولُوا دَرَسْتَ and وَلْيَقُولُوا دَرَسْتَ, what are we actually talking about right there? So inshallah, we'll also get to more details about those ayat, of course, inshallah. Let's summarize really quick what we had done. So number 1, basically telling us on that page, or those pages, number 1, focusing on the tawheed of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Number 2, telling us about the magnificence and the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the perfect knowledge that we basically can process, but He's basically laying out the evidence, and we have to have that intention to process it and not let our arrogance lead us to misguidance. And certainly guidance is by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as well, and clear insights, they come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whoever is guided benefits himself, and at the end, whoever misguides himself, they're basically the ones to be held accountable. And that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically the one to protect the Prophet from I guess the accusations, or probably protect the message itself, and that even if they were to go in opposition, that is to basically let the Prophet know that their opposition is not going to affect truth. Their opposition is only affecting them and not affecting the reality of what the truth is, and certainly to stay in the parameter of truth, of guidance. It's basically telling us, well, you follow guidance regardless of how the opposition might go in fierce or violent or whatever it is. At the end, you basically need to lay and make sure those you're standing your grounds. And standing your ground, it doesn't necessarily mean to go attack their gods, but it just means you stand your ground and laying out the truth. And at the end, know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to be the one that determines the victory, and his words will always be in victory. This is it. Subhanakallah wa bihamdik, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta. Tomorrow, inshallah, there's actually some details about those ayat, quite exciting, to be honest. And I actually prepared some details in regards to that, so please stay tuned. I learned something new, to be honest. So yeah, let's see what we're gonna learn about tomorrow. Inshallah, inshallah, inshallah. And we're gonna talk about darasta, and what does the word darasa actually mean? Well, darasa means to stamp something. To stamp? What do you mean stamp? I thought darasa, they always taught us that it was to learn. Lugha Arabiya is so intricate and so detailed. Stay tuned to see the relationship between darasa, to stamp something, and to learn something, and the relationship with what we talked about today. How you process things, how you recognize, learn, memorize. What does it mean? Stay tuned for tomorrow, inshallah. A lot to say. We don't want to, blow everything up right now. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, inshallah. No questions. All right, man. Or perhaps somebody just wanted to, let's do this.